Imagine being one of the most powerful military commanders on the planet, backed by the strongest navy in the world, and still losing without ever fighting a real battle. That is exactly what happened to the British Empire in 1775. They had crushed rebellions across 3 continents, and their generals were so confident that they looked at the colonial militia surrounding Boston and called them nothing more than a disorganized mob. Within months, that so-called mob would trap 11,000 British soldiers on a narrow strip of land, starve them through a brutal winter, and force the mightiest army on earth to quietly pack up and sail away in defeat. This is the story of how a group of farmers, shopkeepers, and one 25-year-old bookseller humiliated an empire. And it all began with one reckless decision that turned Massachusetts into a war zone overnight. By the spring of 1775, Boston was already sitting on a powder keg. British troops had occupied the city since 1668, and every year the tension grew worse. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and a string of punishing laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts had pushed the relationship past the point of repair. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in North America, controlled thousands of troops, a harbor full of warships, and the full support of King George III. On paper, his position looked untouchable, but underneath that confidence was a growing fear that the colonists were quietly arming themselves for a fight nobody in London wanted to admit was coming in. Gage decided to act. On the night of April 18th, he sent 700 British soldiers marching toward the town of Concord to seize a hidden stockpile of colonial weapons. It was meant to be simple, a quick strike against untrained civilians who would scatter at the first sign of resistance. Instead, when the British reached Lexington at dawn, colonial militia were already lined up, waiting for them. A single shot rang out. Nobody knows from which side, and history now calls it the shot heard round the world. That one gunshot lit a fuse that could not be put out. The British pushed on to Concord, only to find that most of the weapons had already been moved. Then, on the march back to Boston, thousands of colonial militiamen appeared from behind stone walls, tree lines, and farmhouses, firing again and again as fresh fighters kept replacing the ones who ran out of ammunition. These British soldiers had been trained for open battlefields, standing in neat rows facing an enemy they could see. Instead, they were being torn apart by farmers who fired from cover and vanished before anyone could respond. By the time the exhausted column stumbled back into Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, and the war had truly begun. News of Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire through New England, and within days, thousands of militia fighters from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island marched toward Boston. These were not soldiers by trade. They were blacksmiths, farmers, and tradesmen who brought their own muskets and their own food because they believed in something bigger than themselves. By the end of April, roughly 15,000 of them had surrounded the city, sealing off the only land route in or out through a narrow strip called Boston Neck. Overnight, the greatest military power in the world found itself trapped on a peninsula, barely a mile wide. The Royal Navy still controlled the harbor, but colonial privateers began attacking supply ships, sinking some and forcing others off course. Food became scarce, firewood ran out, and soldiers began tearing apart abandoned buildings just to stay warm. Smallpox spread through the crowded streets, and one resident wrote that every face in the city had turned pale from hunger and fear. The British generals were furious about being trapped by what they still saw as an amateur militia, so they devised a plan to break out by seizing the high ground north of the city, starting with the hills on the Charlestown Peninsula.
The colonists discovered the plan and moved first. On the night of June 16th, 1,200 militiamen quietly built fortifications on Breed's Hill, right within cannon range of the British lines. When the sun rose, the British were stunned to see an entire fort had appeared overnight. General William Howe launched a direct assault with 3,000 troops, marching straight up the hill into concentrated musket fire. The first wave was cut down. The second wave was cut down just as badly. Only on the third charge, after the colonists ran out of ammunition, did the British finally take the hill. But the cost was staggering, with over 1,000 casualties in barely 2 hours of fighting.
That battle, remembered today as Bunker Hill, technically counted as a British victory, but it broke something inside their command. Nearly a third of the attacking force was dead or wounded, and a disproportionate number were officers the Army could not easily replace. General Howe never forgot the sight of his men falling in rows, and that memory would shape every decision he made for the rest of the war. After Bunker Hill, the British stopped attacking altogether and settled into a defensive standoff, waiting behind their walls while the colonists waited behind theirs. And for a while, it seemed like nothing would ever change.
Then, on July 3rd, George Washington rode into camp to take command of the newly formed Continental Army. What he found horrified him. There was no real discipline, no consistent supplies, and officers who had been elected by their own men rather than trained to lead them. Even worse, gunpowder was so dangerously low that if the British had known the truth, they could have simply walked out and ended the siege that same week. Washington kept that secret from almost everyone, while he spent months turning this loose collection of militias into something resembling a real army, facing resistance from soldiers who saw him as an outsider, and enlistment terms that kept expiring at the worst possible moments.
What Washington needed most was heavy artillery, and the only source close enough was Fort Ticonderoga, nearly 300 miles away, where 59 captured cannons sat unused. He gave the mission to a 25-year-old former bookseller named Henry Knox, a man with no military training, but an obsessive passion for military science, learned entirely from books. Most of Washington's advisors thought the plan was insane, hauling cannons weighing thousands of pounds across frozen rivers, mountain passes, and wilderness roads in the dead of winter. Knox accepted the mission anyway, and what followed became known as the Noble Train of Artillery, one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the entire war. Knox and his men floated the cannons down a freezing lake before the ice could trap them, then hauled everything overland using teams of oxen through blizzards and bitter cold. At one crossing, a cannon broke through the ice and sank, and Knox's men had to drag it back out by hand. Oxen collapsed from exhaustion and had to be replaced by fresh teams from nearby farms, and Knox himself nearly froze walking through snowdrifts 3 feet deep. After nearly 6 grueling weeks, every single cannon arrived safely in Boston without a single piece lost, and Washington finally had the weapon he needed to change everything. He knew exactly where to place them. On the night of March 4th, under cover of a diversionary bombardment designed to mask the noise, thousands of soldiers hauled prefabricated fortifications and Knox's cannons up Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city and the harbor. By morning, the British woke up to find an entire fortified position staring down at their fleet, as if it had appeared by magic overnight. Their cannons could not even reach the heights, and one officer admitted the work looked like something out of Aladdin's lamp. General Howe considered a suicidal assault, but ultimately realized the price would be another Bunker Hill, and this time, even worse.
On March 17, 1776, more than 11,000 British soldiers and over 1,000 Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed away from Boston for good. Defeated not by a single dramatic battle, but by persistence, clever strategy, and the sheer will of ordinary people who refused to give up. The siege had lasted 11 months, and it proved something the world could no longer ignore: that untrained farmers and tradesmen, led by the right kind of leadership, could stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful army on earth and win. It did not end the war, but it proved the war could be won. And that single truth changed everything that came after.